We're live. I'm Jonno Proudfoot, and this is the Superhero Podcast. I have Chris Webster, PhD, researcher of exercise science and diabetes in the house. And today we are going to be talking about the science of low carbohydrate eating and exercise performance. So, Chris, welcome to the show. Is exercise performance or elite performance actually possible on a low carb diet?
Yeah, thanks, Jonno. Thanks for having me. I think it's possible, and it's a very difficult question to answer. And I don't think it's something that's actually being answered in the literature, in the scientific literature. And in general, the sports performance that has been studied is endurance performance, so specifically cycling and running. And in those two fields, the consensus, the mainstream consensus would be that elite performance is not possible on a low carb, high fat diet. But then there are all sorts of other scenarios where I think there's a benefit, and I'm not sure that's a consensus, but the evidence is quite weak.
Okay, and when you say consensus, so what is the difference between like elite and normal performance?
So I guess the elite would be the people winning events. So like the Kenyans at marathons, Tour de France level cyclists, Olympic athletes. So I'd say that's the kind of true elites. And then you get, we say like well-trained or sub-elite would be the people winning or competing at a high level local competitions, or at least are training to get good performances. And then you get sort of recreational athletes training for fun and for health and want to feel good.
Okay, and you said in one of your studies, I'll actually post a link to the studies in this later on. So if you're watching this recording, just check the comments. And you were saying there's a difference between like short bursts of high intensity and endurance. You've actually like tiered the different segments. What are the different segments? Like 1 to 4 minutes or?
So I suppose within endurance sport, you can break it down to ultra endurance, which is where you start getting longer than 4 hours. And sort of regular endurance events around 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours, or 1.5 to 3 hours. And then you get high intensity endurance. So anything in the region of like 40 minutes, that type of range. And then you get very high intensity endurance, which is things like maybe a 1K, something along those lines. So that's all. And then your energy needs are different for all of those things. And the intensity you can maintain is much higher. Obviously, the shorter it is, the higher the intensity, and vice versa. So low carb, in theory, the theory would be that low carb, you benefit the most in the ultra endurance because you're carrying all this fuel around, all the fat around, and you're operating when you do an Ironman or something like that. Especially, see, the elites, it's slightly different because they do an Ironman, they're in a very high intensity the whole time anyway. But as soon as you go one level down, the intensity is low enough that you can burn fat at that intensity. So in theory, that those types of durations, low carb should have a benefit because you've got all this fuel and you can access it. You don't need to eat, and you should just have a stable supply of energy. That's sort of that's where the interest originally came from when researchers started, and they were trying to unlock all this fat for ultra endurance and endurance exercise.
Okay, so now my printer's working. It's like, if anyone's wondering what the noise is. So the there's a lot of consensus, well, at least amongst the lay people, that like low carb will increase performance. But and what you're saying is like not really.
Well, I think you can't make it if you want to be like scientific about it. You can't actually make a definitive statement like that because the level of evidence The nutrition is incredibly difficult to study, and sports performance is very difficult to study. So if you're going to say something like a low carb diet will increase performance, that you can definitely find evidence in the literature to support that statement. And there are loads of examples of individuals who've benefited. But in terms of proof, you can't say that. But you can't really say it's been proven that a high carb diet is beneficial either. Just because proof in a field like nutrition and exercise science is too difficult to get definitively. So that's a problem with research more than a problem with. So it's not something to strive for. I think you have to look at each. If you're a coach, you have to look at each individual and experiment and play around, because there's no definitive answer to what should you eat. Yeah,
well, that's for damn sure. So you did the study with Jeroen, I've forgotten his surname, but he is fantastic doctor. Yeah, Swart. And Tim, actually, in Noakes, for those not sure, Tim is. And you studied a study of one, so there was one athlete. What did you study and what did they do?
So this was a guy who came to us, and he'd been on a proper ketogenic low carb diet for 2 years, and we describe him in the article as an elite athlete, and that's because he's in his age group level, which was, I think he was 32 or 33 at the time, something like that. In his age group, he was winning local competitions, and finishing in the top 10 in international competitions. So he had a good record, and he was winning these. This was Ironman level and half Ironman level events. So he was winning these things on a low carb diet.
Sure.
And the only supplements I think he took salt and water during the event. So it was doing what we understand as low carb. It wasn't, it was a proper low carb diet. So what we did in that paper is we just described this firstly. And I think the important point there is you can be on a low carb diet and compete at a very high level.
Yeah.
And this is a point, articles coming out in the literature all the time saying you can't. And I got around to, at one point, just writing a letter and citing that article and saying, well, you can. So it's an important point to make that it can be done. And then what he wanted to do is he was transitioning to shorter events. So sprint, triathlons, that type of thing. And he wondered if he would need some carbohydrate for higher intensity. So we actually introduced carbohydrate, and we did it before and after. And we did find an increase in his performance I think we had a 30-minute, we had an event, a time trial for him that was 30 minutes, I think. And he did actually get an improvement.
When he had the carbohydrate?
But the way he added it was he actually didn't change his diet. He just added carbohydrate during training. So he had 60 grams per hour of carbohydrate.
What is that like in a GU? Is that like one GU or?
I think a GU is possibly, the standard GU is like 30 or 15 grams. I'm not actually sure. I'm a bit out of touch with things like that. But it's an Energade. I think a standard Energade is like 75 grams. So it would be more or less like having one of those during an hour while you're exercising.
Sorry, just to clarify. So this guy's he's training all the time, and he's generally eating the low carb diet, but while he trains, he has like liquid carbs in the form of Energade or whatever.
So what we did with him is we gave him a supplement similar to Energade that he was to take at 60 grams during the hour, 3 times a week when he did high intensity intervals. So he only actually took the supplement 3 times a week. And I think our thing was 6 weeks, if I remember. I think so. He trained for 6 weeks without supplements, and then he did another 6 week with supplements. And then in the performance trials, he had supplements.
Now, how do you differentiate between like an increase? This is something I've always wondered about when you're doing a study on fitness, especially. It's like, surely it makes a difference when you do which one, because if you do like 5 weeks of consistent effort of training, and that's like the control period, and then you do like the supplement in the second 5 weeks, you're 5 weeks ahead in terms of your training. So surely you'll perform better in the second 5 weeks than the first.
Yeah, but what we did is it's a real problem, and there are the ways you try and get around it in bigger trials is you randomize the order. But what we did is, because he's such an elite level athlete, we put him on a maintenance program during that time. So he wasn't actually training to get better.
Okay.
He was just training to maintain fitness. And but again, like you could even feel better on the day. We also try and account for a learning effect. So we do familiarization trials, things like that. But you can't fully account for all of these things. You can do your best. Okay. And so what we did is we had a maintenance program and we did familiarization trials. So
I'm going to get to the weight low carb exercise thing just now, because I think whatever we'll get there. But you said that in the study you said it's cool. Bark it out. You said he was fat adapted athlete, but he'd been on a ketogenic diet for 2 years. So what's the difference between like being in ketosis and being fat adapted?
Okay. So I would say fat adapted to me means, so these are now my definitions. I would say it means you are primarily using fat for energy. So you can measure whether someone is using carbohydrate or fat at rest and during exercise. And someone who's fat adapted will generally at rest, you'll be burning 100% fat. And even at low intensity exercise, 100% fat. And then as exercise intensity increases, fat is pretty much the main component of the energy production, all the way up to like that guy we studied. He was still burning. I think we got him up. We measured him at 1.8 grams per minute of fat at something like 85% of VO2 max. So he was still mainly burning fat, even at 80%, 85% of his VO2 max. So I think keto adapted, I think it's the same thing, but with ketones, they just want to see, you want to measure it and see you have ketones.
Okay.
But I don't really see that there's such a difference. I guess if you want to be keto adapted, you can be fat adapted and still have very low ketone levels.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah, because one of the things that like we help people with a lot, and there's a lot of gray, is like you get this feeling of being sluggish, and when you're going into ketosis, so you're like not necessarily in fat burning, and then I've heard people just complaining, for the first month even of being keto, like you actually feel like bursting with energy when you go into ketosis, but as soon as you start training, you just feel completely flat. So what's happening there?
I think it's just an adaptation period, and it's quite well documented that you need, I'd say, 4 to 6 weeks as a minimum before you start feeling quite good again. But there's debate as to how long you actually need before you can get 100% back to where you were. But I think what's essentially happening is you've been training, especially for athletes. We train and we get used to how it feels, and we've adapted to a way of doing things. And your body relies on feedback. When you're pacing yourself and when you go for a run, your body has a whole bunch of internal feedback mechanisms. So it kind of can assess where it is and how it's feeling. And on a keto diet or on a low carb diet, it's all, the feedback's completely different. So I think there's just an adaptation that has to take place. You just need to get used to how it feels, and because people long-term adapted to low carb diets will have, when you start a run, let's say, you'll have less glycogen than people who carbo load and use high carb diets will have at the end of a run. So so you just your body needs to learn that it can manage without all of that.
Yeah, and that's the next thing is so you said this guy had carbs during his cycling, and I know that you've done other studies which I also want to touch on, but like for me, I feel better when I eat carbs. So I don't eat like gluten and I stay away from sugar, but I do feel better when I'm training and I'm eating carbs.
Yeah.
And so like what I would love is to be like keto most of the time, but then to eat carbs, but then to train on carbs. Like I don't know if like when I finished a big run or when I get primed for a run, like the last thing I feel like eating is like fat. Yeah. And also I don't run. I feel heavy if I have like meat in me when I'm, if I eat like 5 hours earlier. So is there like a marriage where you can be a high carb athlete but a ketogenic person?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think that's kind of what we tried to do with that study with that athlete is we said eat carbs when you're training high intensity, eat carbs when you're racing high intensity, but otherwise don't. Because also those carbohydrates will be, essentially they'll be burned during the exercise session itself. And I think when it comes to exercise, it's very individual thing. So if you feel better training with carbohydrate, then I'd say there's really no harm in that. And this is where I think the psychology of it comes in is a lot of people struggle with sugar addiction. And their problem with carbohydrate is not so much that the food itself, it's the impact of the food. So if they had an energate after gym, it would trigger an afternoon of bad eating. So yeah. I'd say those are the pitfalls that have to be avoided. So, but I don't think there's any health concerns with having some carbohydrates around exercise.
Well, so then the next question is around someone who is really insulin resistant and they are trying to exercise. I mean, I think a lot of people try to exercise to lose weight, and I would argue that to do everything except for lose weight because it will make you feel incredible, blah, 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 but like might not help you lose weight. So what happens if you are insulin resistant? Should you just force yourself to adapt to going low carb so that you don't ingest carb and convert that to fat? Or is there like a period where you can still burn it before it turns into fat?
I think we need to make a distinction between a healthy person who's training for performance and somebody who's exercising to try and improve their health. Because if generally an insulin-resistant person, I would associate with overweight and obesity and perhaps even insulin resistance. And if that's the case, then having an energate after gym is just completely counterproductive. And you want, once that person has improved their health and now they're training to run their fastest 21K ever, then you need to start optimizing. Then you can start thinking about optimizing training. But it's just not necessary. And most people, you just want to exercise is about fun and feeling good. And there's no, like the performance advantage we're talking about here with these elite athletes is tiny. It's just not, there was the series of studies with these elite race walkers and they went keto for 3 weeks and they showed that they lost performance, but it was like 30 seconds or 40 seconds off their race times, off a 10K race time, which is very significant if you're trying to win a race.
Yeah.
If you're competing with a field of 100 elite athletes, that's extremely significant. But if we're talking about the average person at 40 seconds off a 10K race walk, it's just not worth it.
So you're saying if you've got 30 kilograms to lose and being high carb is going to give you like a 30-second edge, you probably want to sacrifice the carbs and lose the 30 kilos.
Yeah, focus on the health, focus on what the foods that make you feel good during the full day and the long term. I would say, but this is where every individual has their own battles and they have to figure it out for themselves. And I think there probably is a point where experimenting with carbohydrate during exercise is something, I think anyone who's exercising a lot should maybe, there's no harm in trying it. But it's extremely important to bear in mind it's individual, the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, so I often get people who ask me, like, who, like a weekend warrior like myself, saying, desperately trying to go keto and be an athlete. Yeah. And, I kind of sit and, I read the paper you wrote for our course like 5 years ago, and it was the same thing. Like, you might not actually need to go through all of that, like, to get better performance.
Yeah.
And it sounds like.
Sorry, it might not be compromising, because I think for a lot of people it becomes almost a pride thing. Like you're doing it just to say you keto.
Yeah.
And at that point, it's not necessary.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I can't think of a downside of like taking in carbohydrates during your high intensity training, but being keto elsewhere for a healthy, fit person.
Yeah.
Like a health downside. So.
No, and so this is the other thing is when you, and I don't know if this relates to bonking or not, which I'd also like you to talk about. But when you, in fact, I'm trying to think of it, could you just explain what bonking is in the athletics context?
Yeah. So the other name for it is hitting the wall.
Right. Okay.
Essentially, what happens is you run out of glycogen, and because carbohydrate adapted athletes are extremely dependent on glycogen, and they have limits to how much fat they can burn. So I'll just put a number on it. The maximum rates of fat oxidation we typically see in carbohydrate adapted athletes is around 0.6, 0.7 grams per minute. And even at the end of a endurance session, it won't go much higher than that. Whereas in a fat-adapted athletes, when we did well-trained athletes, we saw 1.2 grams per minute, and then in elite athletes, 1.6 to 1.8 grams per minute. So there's a massive difference there. So what happens with bonking is you run out of glycogen, and there's just limited carbohydrate available in the body. And then the typical symptoms are just you feel complete lack of energy, like muscles go heavy, and there's often a brain fog or dizziness. And that's because the brain can't get the carbohydrate. There's competition for resources now between the muscles and the brain.
Okay. But then I've also heard of post-exercise ketosis. And my understanding is that when you run out of carbs, your body automatically tries to click into fat. So what's the difference between so you can bonk and just go flat, but then there's also this thing where you go into ketosis while you're exercising?
For a keto adapted athlete? Yeah.
No, so I've heard of, like even Tim talks about like having been, like his wife used to tell him that he was ketotic after a big run. Yeah.
So the whole thing is a transitionary state. So one of the things I observed in our athletes was at the end of exercise, their ketone level spiked massively. But I think all that was happening was because while you're exercising, fat is being released from the fat cells and it's circulating through the body. And then when you stop exercising, that fat is not being used anymore by the muscles, and it just gets converted to ketones.
Okay.
So it's more. So I don't think it's really that meaningful. I think it's just a natural physiological process, and I guess it would happen, especially if someone who's not fat adapted went for a 6-hour or 4-hour low intensity run. I don't see why they wouldn't be in some form of ketosis at the end of that when they stopped, especially because they'll be at their maximum fat use by the end, and then all that fat and all those it's there in the system, and something needs to happen with it.
Yeah. Well, so where I'm going with that is then surely exercising. If you bonk, for instance, like if you are trying to get into ketosis, like a bonk or hitting the wall, it puts you like at the precipice. Like now is the time where your body's like, well, either we've got to get more glucose, or you just wait a little bit and you'll be in ketosis. Is that like real?
Yeah, I mean you would be, but it's the same as it's like speeding up the process of fasting. So if you take a non-fat adapted person and you just tell them not to eat, they'll be in ketosis after 2-3 days. But if you tell them to not, if you get them to run instead, they'll be in ketosis a bit quicker because you burn through the glucose a bit quicker. So it's the same. I think it's the same process. But what you can't do is bridge that gap between the 0.7 grams per minute or 0.6 grams per minute and the 1.4 grams per minute of a fat adapted person. That you can't do in a single session. It's almost like a threshold effect. Yeah, where you need to go through a few days of without carbs before you can access that type of level of fat adaptation. So you can't transition. Yeah, you can't transition. The process of transitioning from carb adapted to fat adapted, in the sense that your fat oxidation rates can get right up to a decent level. That takes time.
Okay. And then on the point of bonking, is it possible, because I know that you cycle, hey? And I know we used to CrossFit, but when I have felt like maybe I'm bonking, there's this psychology that comes about. You're like, geez, I feel broken. And now my mind's going, Jonno, stop being such a little, stop whining, harden up. And my body's going, dude, I'm serious. I really am not doing well. Is there a way that you can tell whether you're being a wuss or it's a genuine bonk?
Have you felt that you've been bonking on a low carb diet?
Well, I like I said, I'm definitely gluten free, low to no sugar, but I've learned over the last few years that I much prefer having carbs while I'm training. So I haven't really trained without carbs for a while. Yeah.
So bonking, it's a very distinct feeling, and you'll know when it's happening. You'll be running along at a decent speed, and the next thing you have to give 100% effort just to keep moving.
Right.
And so people know when they've hit the wall. So one of the things we've observed, and that's documented, is that you actually can't. That's one of the things that goes away once you're fat adapted, is you no longer bonk, because you'll always have a pretty decent energy supply.
Yeah. So carry on. Sorry.
The brain can use ketones very effectively, and it's not. I'm not 100%. I haven't seen proof of this, but the theory is that you can't bonk because of ketones to the brain. But I think regardless of whether it's ketones or just carbohydrates can be used for the brain, because your fat oxidation is so high, your energy supply is constant. Yeah. And bonking's not I'd say that's one of the indicators that someone can look at as to whether they should try a low carb diet for performance. People who have difficulties with bonking. Because that's an indication that maybe your metabolism or glucose metabolism is a bit out, not working 100% the way you might want. And my supervisor on these studies, he actually had a situation where he's a big cyclist, and he would have a meal and kind of an hour before riding, and then he would have a glucose spike. So that's kind of, which feels a bit like a bonking. And he had have the glucose spike and then the dip, and that was the energy at the end. So a low carb diet was good for him to eat before a ride because it avoided that. But yeah, so that's a good indication. So that's one of the things it's quality of life thing for me. So I don't really even know if I'm that much slower on a low carb diet, but I know that I don't hit the wall ever.
Yeah. And so you know you don't have to. So and this is the other thing is that, when I'm running with guys now. So the first when I was super low carb, in 2013, 14, 15, I remember one of the great things everyone talks about is all you need is water. And so there were a few things that kind of became associated with low carb that were actually associated with everyone. You don't ever actually need energy for anything under 2 hours. So I'd run a half marathon and just have water. I'd also never take goos and snacks and whatever. And now when we run on the mountain, like my mates have all got their backpacks, which is like an extra kg of weight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're like, you've got to drink, you're going to die if you don't drink. And in the past, I was like, no, I'm on low carb, so I can last. And then I was like, but hang on, like, even if I'm on a high carb diet, I can still just not drink water and I'll be fine. So, like, what are the things that are unique to low carb? Like, is salt tablets, for instance, another thing? Or are these the hydration and like electrolyte stuff? Is that independent of your diet?
Yeah, I think you can apply that to any diet. And again, it's just an experimentation thing. So people who are struggling with cramps might want to take salt with them. Some people just don't struggle with cramps at all. Yeah. I'm quite good. Generally, I'm not too fussed about water when I'm out riding. Like, I'm happy to get dehydrated, but some people get very thirsty and need to carry water. So there's a personalized aspect there. But I think carrying the goos and the sugary drinks and the food around is very much about that's like a carbohydrate adapted athlete thing. And on low carb, you generally don't need to do it. Just what this Ironman athlete we studied, I think when I spoke to him later, what he's adapted his eating towards is he'll put a bottle on the bike. So the swim, obviously everyone doesn't eat on the swim or drink. And then he'll have something on the bike, and then that's it. That gets him through to the end.
Yeah. Well, it's terrible running with a full tummy. So if you have something like as you get on the bike, especially for Ironman, you've got like 90 Ks to burn it off before you actually have to go and bounce up and down.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a question about the other side of your research, because I know you've done some diabetes stuff. Tell us about the study you did with diabetics.
Okay. So what we did is we investigated type 2 diabetes reversal, which it's one of these things where until recently the mainstream idea was that you can't reverse type 2 diabetes. It's a chronic progressive disease where you just manage it and you increase treatment, which generally means medication. And so that was at the time when I started this about 5 years ago. That was the thinking. And then we know from Professor Noakes and a lot of testimonies that he received that people are reversing their type 2 diabetes all over the place. So what we did is we recruited people who had confirmed type 2 diabetes diagnoses, and we investigated their diets, and we looked at their blood markers, and we also interviewed them to try and understand their perspective on what has happened. So in the end, we recruited 28 people who had confirmed type 2 diabetes, and probably, if I remember correctly, about 16 of them had fully reversed their type 2 diabetes, to the point where if you were to recruit them now and do blood markers and look at their health, you wouldn't be able to detect that they'd ever had diabetes.
True,
and
really?
Then, yeah.
Like cured, reversed 100%.
Yeah, so we called it complete remission. In other words, their blood glucose was completely normal, and the weight loss, their weight was normal, and there's nothing detectable to the insulin levels, everything. And then partial remission, there were a few in partial remission, which just meant that their blood markers wouldn't meet the criteria of a type 2 diabetes diagnosis, but we can still see that there's some problems. You could like maybe elevated insulin or something along those lines. And then a few who still would get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. But mostly they were people who had, even though they still were on their medications, they'd lost a pretty large amount of weight and reduced medications. So we basically just documented that type 2 diabetes reversal can and actually is happening. And we described the diet that these people were on.
Yeah, so that's awesome. Like, do you not think that one of the things that scares the medical fraternity about the low carb diet is the fact that it's associated with the high fat diet?
Yeah.
You know, like, it's all very well to say, I mean, I just wonder what a doctor or dietitian would say if instead of saying, no, we did it on a low carb, high fat diet, you just said low carb and like fat wasn't an issue. Do you not think they would be more receptive?
Yeah, I think the name has irritated a lot of people. And Banting, a lot of people get, especially dietitians and doctors, there's a reaction to the word Banting, even though there's no difference between keto or Banting or low carb, in my opinion. So yeah, but I think it's even though that might be true, the responsibility shouldn't really be on people trying to improve their lives to be careful about how they phrase their diet to their doctors. Otherwise, they don't get support. Which is in our interviews, that's one of the things that came up, is one of the biggest barriers is actually the support of doctors. So people are, they've seen these great results, then they're going to their doctors and the doctors are putting loads of doubt in their minds. So I actually think the doctors are a barrier to, in some cases, and it's changed. But back then, the doctors and health professionals are creating a barrier to improved health for this group of people like this with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes.
What's the largest group of potentially sick people in the world? So it's a big number. So I think, I can't help thinking, like, I agree with you, and from a moral standpoint, like, I 100% back that idea. Like, it should be easy for people to get treatment. But for the evangelists like myself, I always wonder, like, are we not doing a disservice to the movement? Like, I mentioned this yesterday, like vegans who I also, admire and appreciate, and I think a lot of vegan activists also care for people's health, and we just have different views. But like, the way that I was recruited as a vegan, which I never became, was like, you are a murderer and you hate animals and whatever. And I was like, fuck you, man. Like, I'm not that's not going to get me to be like considerate and think about it. So I don't think they did themselves any favors going that route. And so I wonder, like, whether we're not guilty of it a bit, like, instead of giving the finger to the man and saying, your diet's crap, take our high fat diet, we shouldn't be slightly clever about it and be like, hey, well, there's this method that we found to reverse diabetes for your patients. There are ways you can do it without high saturated fat, and like, maybe it's worth just dipping a toe in. I don't know what you think.
I mean, it's a compromise, because I think that's because you've got your program, and that's your problem with marketing. So but I don't feel that, like, saturated fat is fine as far as the evidence, as far as I can tell from the evidence that exists, the research that's out there, saturated fat is fine. So why you should then have to say, okay, well, I'm going to eat a low carb diet, but I'm also going to eat a low saturated fat diet. It's like just a compromise.
But is it a compromise if you had to say, because for instance, like monounsaturated fats, like avocado oil, the nut and fruit oils, like they're the goodies basically. And
but even that is that's just an accepted relic from the original dietary guidelines and from the marketing of the Mediterranean diet. So here, my perspective on what happened there is the low-fat diet was adopted. That was back in 1977, and then later spread around the world. And then it turned out that if you added fat in, it's actually healthier for you. And the diet that got that reputation was the Mediterranean diet with olive oil.
Right.
So olive oil just became a source of fat. And it turns out, and then it's like, oh, it's a hell. And then it got marketed by the olive oil groups and the Europeans. And it just turned into this whole thing that olive oil is healthy.
Right.
But I don't think there's any particular proof that olive oil is healthier than, I don't know, saturated fat.
Yeah,
I think it's a fact.
Yeah. No, so I'm like punching way above my weight here. So take everything I say with a pinch of salt. But what they do know is that polyunsaturated fats are super bad, right?
Yeah. So you need it again. It's stuff that it's changed. But polyunsaturated fats have been thought of as very healthy, and those are all your fish oils. So that's a specific type of polyunsaturated fat, but they still have a reputation of being healthy and desirable, like your omega-6s and omega-3s.
I'm talking about okay, I thought like sunflower oil, for instance, is super high in puffers. So yes, that is omega-6, but
yeah, that's your omega-6s. So yeah, but now I think I think there's a movement, a realization that omega-6s are bad, or at least the ratio between omega-3s and omega-6s. But again, they have a better reputation than saturated fat.
Totally.
Polyunsaturated fats. But my understanding of the research, you want to keep them low. Polyunsaturated fats low. And then what we found is like the diabetics that we quantified their diets, they were eating about the same amount of energy from saturated fat and monounsaturated fats.
Okay, cool. So
which worked out at about 90% of fat intake.
Okay, wow. So hypothetically, you could, if there was a dietitian who was saying, "There's no ways I'll do saturated fats in excess," or not even in excess, then like as a as you could say, well, if that scares you, you can always just say use like monos and like the same. Even though I know that you're saying there's nothing wrong with saturated, and you'd rather like win the argument and say, listen, you're being an idiot. But like for the sake of helping the patient, you could say, look, if saying you can use monos is going to make you prescribe this diet to your diabetic patient, then use monos.
Yeah, sure. But it's not just like, where does it end then? Because the next thing is salt, and then there's eggs, if cholesterol. So it's a bottomless pit of compromises.
That's true.
I don't know. I know where I stand personally. I think it's a difficult job for a program like you have. I just don't know what the solution to this is, because the entrenchment of diet, of like these ideas of healthy whole grains, cholesterol is bad for you, salt is bad for blood pressure. These ideas are so entrenched that I don't really see a way. I don't really see the answer, other than you need to teach people to try and think for themselves, I guess. I don't really know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of like a little. Look, I don't know how much time we got. I think we've got to wrap it up soon. But I desperately want to talk to you about salt. But I think just to end that point, I think like if you, because I've had this conversation with the converted. So someone's like Banting, oh my God, I'm so keen. And then even though they're converted and they're like trying to get it adapted to it, they're like, what about salt? What about cholesterol? I'm worried that I'm going to die if I eat the butter. And my cholesterol was like 6.5. And obviously I'm like, well, that according to what I know, that's not high, but apparently that's what. So the point is that there are all these things that you have to get your head around to be on the same page as like, so our dietitian, for instance. And so like getting a dietitian who at the moment is prescribing like a high carb, like low fat diet to a diabetic, to say to her, I mean, listen to us, like sports scientists and chef talking about what dietitian should do, but to say, look, okay, let's just think about the patient here. Like, let's just drop the carbs this week and get your head around that. And like, if you can see that in 4 weeks' time their bloods have improved, maybe you can chew on the next thing, which is like, I don't know, taking gluten out of the equation, or like not worrying about salt, because you can't. No one can like digest all of this in one sitting and be like, okay, yesterday I was pro high carb, today I'm a new person, and the future's different.
Yeah, I think if we can put the emphasis on the patient and the patient's health, and realize that what we're trying to do really is improve people's health and not be right. That's the goal. And I think it's the challenge is that in the medical profession and dietetics they're so entrenched and taught what they believe is right that it's a tough task to change that. But I mean, I think that's a really good approach, is turn the focus on the patient's health and say, like, if we can lose weight or improve some symptoms,
Totally.
have a concrete outcome that any health professional will have to agree with. And that's actually one of the things we found in our study on the diabetes patients, is the doctors did in general come around. Like when you see someone who's been on insulin for 10 years, suddenly they're off insulin, they've lost 50 kilograms, and they're exercising because they feel good, and their blood markers are perfect, cholesterol's improved, which doesn't always happen, but for many people it does. Improved by the standards that people are looking for. So it does happen sometimes. And then the doctors, they do become supportive and get right behind the patient. So if the health professional is seeing improvements, they will generally come around to support him.
Yeah,
but they might not advise new patients to follow the same approach. It's a whole different.
That's crazy. So look, Chris, we got to go soon, but I wanted to just pick your brain on the last thing, and you did this brilliant talk. In fact, I'll make a note. I'll put the link in the stream as well. You just talk at Low Carb, wherever it was, but it's on Low Carb Down Under. And you were talking about how like the kind of almost like paradoxes in research. And one of the things you touched on was the fact that like epidemiological studies are not considered good nutritional evidence. But then there are instances where they've used them, for instance, like in smoking, they have actually used epidemiological evidence to change like legislation. So we're not going to solve the nutrition problem, but if you could just paint a picture of like where the complexity lies in nutrition research, that would be a great one to end off on. Okay, cool.
So what I spoke about there is levels of evidence, and your highest level of evidence would be a randomized control trial. But there are a lot of problems with randomized control trials in nutrition. So there are randomized control trials, but they're generally quite short. Like the longer ones would be like a year, 2 years. But then you have massive compliance issues, and you also only studying with controlled trials. You only study one thing. So you have two different diets, but you can't actually. It's very difficult to isolate what you're studying. So my point there was that randomized controlled trials in nutrition don't provide a very high level of evidence. They actually provide quite a low level of evidence. And then the other big branch of science in nutrition is observational studies. And these are when you don't do interventions, you just record what people are eating. The big one is called a prospective cohort study. And that's also referred to as epidemiology, where you record what people are eating in a food frequency questionnaire, and then you follow up on them 30 years later. And you associate what they've eaten and the other lifestyle factors with their health outcomes. So this is where pretty much all of the nutrition evidence, it's a low level of evidence, and there's a debate as to whether it's lower than the control trials. But neither of them are very good. And what I talk about in the talk is that you can actually you can get good evidence from observational studies, but you need certain criteria to be met. And with smoking, most of those criteria were met. So an example is when you're dealing with associations, you need very strong associations. And in nutrition, associations are weak, like they're very weak. But in smoking, the association between smoking and lung cancer is very strong. So that's just one example, but I talk about a few other of these criteria in the talk. So essentially the observational evidence or the epidemiology doesn't actually meet any of these criteria. I think I talk about the 9 of them that I discuss in my lecture. And in the talk, I focus on 5 of them, I think. And nutrition epidemiology it doesn't meet. It's so incredibly weak, but regardless, policy is based on the epidemiology. Everything, it's all based on the epidemiology.
So why doesn't something like the Verta Health study, which for those who don't know, it's shown a 50 after 2 years, a 50% remission rate basically for diabetes. So after 1 year it was 60%, and then obviously, I mean, the fan says it's compliance that the last 10% lost, but basically at 2 years, 50% of the people who were in that study have still reversed their diabetes. And then, but that hasn't managed to find its way into any policy.
Yeah, well, that study has had an impact, but you're right. It's because policymakers are not interested in that study. I mean, that's the answer. They're interested in epidemiology, and the way they justify it is they say we need long-term studies,
right?
And we need hard endpoints. So a hard endpoint would be heart disease, or kidney failure, or whatever, a death. Death would be the best hard endpoint. So, but in a randomized control trial, your outcomes are blood glucose and cholesterol and all these things. Yeah. So what they say is that you can only make policy on prospective cohort studies because only prospective cohort studies have the true hard endpoints. So that's how it's justified.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's a good point. This is the thing. It's true, but all this criteria, nutritional prospective cohort studies, are very weak, and they're non-specific, and a whole bunch of other reasons. And you can't elevate these studies to high level of evidence. They're actually stuck with observational evidence, low level of evidence.
Sure.
And the criticisms of Verta Health are true as well, where it's short term because 2 years is short term. It's not a randomized trial. They've got very intensive support systems set up. So there's a lot of reasons why the Verta Health study is not proof or conclusive proof. But in the world out there, on the available nutrition research, it's about as good as there is.
Yeah.
So,
Jeez, that's nuts. Well, Chris, it's been epic, man. Thanks for joining us and imparting all of your wisdom on us. We'd have to get you back to talk about salt and cholesterol and butter and continue the fight over whether or not we should go all in or bit by bit. But yeah, it's been awesome. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.
Cool. Stay on the line.